While South Africa has among the highest levels of protest globally, international studies suggest that communities are more likely to protest when they can clearly attribute blame and where visible institutions are perceived to possess the means for redress. South Africa's deep-seated social inequalities and segregated living conditions provide fertile ground for popular discontent. And in the midst of that, of course, we have, unions that are positioning and have positioned themselves as the voices of workers. More and more, we're seeing calls for a more unified voice from the multiple unions. Tonight, we're joined by South African Federation of Trade Unions General Secretary Zwelinzima Mavavi. Mr. Vavi, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time this evening. It's something that you have been championing, especially under the SAFTU umbrella. This is for unions to be fighting collectively and championing just the interests of workers collectively and not necessarily in the fragmented way that we have seen in this country that perhaps even dilutes the voices of unions. You seem to not be going very far with that.
Well, but it's a noble dream that we shouldn't give up on. And because we now, and everybody, in particular from the worker perspective, would have seen what devastating impact disunity, fragmentization, as well as the fact that lesser and lesser numbers of workers trust unions in our country. We've seen government this year only toying, playing, and fooling basically the public sector workers, giving them a non-increase of 1.5%, which was nothing but a pay progression that it should have given them on an ordinary year as per the agreement of 2018. We have seen government simply refusing to implement the third leg of the agreement. Last year, it would have reached with the unions in 2018. And a terrible example is now being copied and replicated across the economy by the private sector employers who are following that tune and that leadership set by the ANC conservative government in pursuance of austerity measures and neoliberalism. Now we're facing a phenomenon when all private sector employers are not only retrenching workers left, right, and center, but they are offering them below the inflation increase and sometimes argue that workers should be inspired by what government is doing to them and receive no increase of any kind. And so this issue of unity of all of the federations, but unity based on principle, Catherine, not just unity for the sake of matching the logos and colors. Unity that is centrally going to be based on the fact that unions must be independent from the bosses, from their employers. Unions must be independent from the political parties. Unions must only be answerable to their members through their democratic structures, and that they must remain true to the cause. They must champion a living wage. They must champion the protection of workers in the workplace, and they must make sure that the solidarity between workers and their communities in the civil society formations to understand that all of these battles are but just one battle against neoliberalism, austerity, and the system of capitalism. So only when we get everybody to accept that will we begin to see a more progressive trade union federation in South Africa capable of being trusted by workers.
The public sector wage negotiations, just looking from the perspective of SAFTU, provided fertile ground for unions to come together and try and negotiate under one umbrella. And yet COSATU, of course, snubbing that request. And in fact, we had SAFTU going out to say that it was a populist call that was being made by you. So there didn't really seem to be much support for it. Why do you think that is the case?
But I think if you were to look at the rank and file members of COSATU now, whether they will really have preferred a more united front of public sector workers, be they in SAFTU, COSATU, NACTU, FEDUSA, or not affiliated to any of these federations, and whether that would have not been given workers an added advantage to fight and against the fact that government is cutting not just their wages, but also is making their conditions of employment even much more worse than they were in any other time, when it cuts the budget for policing, for example, when it cut the education budget by billions, and cutting the healthcare budget by billions, leading to a situation where teachers having much more bigger classes with no infrastructure, no laboratories, no libraries, no security, where in the public hospitals there's no infrastructure, fewer nurses, fewer doctors, fewer specialists, and when in the police there's 60,000 vacancies that exist according to the initial commissioner. Now, tell me who will say, let's reject unity because we feel very happy that the unions have no power to stop government intransigence, or its a total commitment to neoliberalism and austerity programs at the expense of not just workers, but at the expense of the entire working class communities. I don't think that any worker in his senses will agree to that, except those few leaders who would have been cultivating for their own careers in government, who are not keen to rock the boat, and who feels that there's absolutely nothing wrong with government punishing the workers and the working class communities in the manner that austerity programs are punishing them.
Well, despite whatever agreements you may have with COSATU, tomorrow, of course, you are going to be attending the opening session of the Central Committee. What exactly does that mean to you, and how much of it, on a personal level, would be a full circle moment?
Historic in this way. And we were dismissed by COSATU mercilessly, and NUMSA was dismissed with just 380,000 members. Other unions who disagreed with the fact that COSATU was dismissing a union for its political views also marched out of COSATU in mass, making COSATU a shadow of its former self as once powerful, fastest growing, militant, independent and fighting trade union federation. All that is gone. We're going back not because we want to boast in any way and say, we told you so, but we're going back to say, but unity remains sacrosanct. Unity of workers is above our head, is above our immediate concerns as leaders. And that the situation now we've just spoken about demands that we be bigger. We be bigger than the personal feelings of all individuals, and to grasp the opportunity with both hands and see whether perhaps this symbolism that COSATU is making to SAFTU of allowing us to attend their meetings and listen to what their concerns are in terms of what is happening politically and socio-economically in our country are not perhaps exactly the same concerns that SAFTU or any other federation will have. These have been coming a little bit, remember, last year in October, COSATU called a strike. We supported the strike not just through public statements, but we went to the street to march. So when we called a general strike in February this year, under the circumstances of a coronavirus lockdown, COSATU issued a public statement to support the strike. When the workers in the public sector were facing the crisis of being bludgeoned by neoliberalism and austerity, we wrote a letter to COSATU and to FEDUSA and others to say, guys, we think we should close ranks now. We should fight together. It's a pity that that didn't come to any fruition.
Sure.
And as a result, government succeeded to divide unions and to implement that totally unacceptable 1.5%, which is, as I've just said, was not an increase but a pay progression, and then gave workers an insulting bribe of 1,200 to 1,600 rands per person, which is not pensionable. So we're happy that we will be attending that conference, and we will see what that means and whether there can be more cooperation and unity on the ground of unity that we have seen, for example, can produce the results. We've seen unity between NUMSA and NUM in ESCOM, that it produces results. We have seen workers in Nelson Mandela Metro fighting together as one formation of labor, and that produces results. And there's no reason why we should not replicate that everywhere else in the economy.
Mr. Vavi, we're going to have to leave it there for tonight. SAF2's, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi is, of course, with SAF2, and we'll be watching then developments around those moves to unify unions in the country.